Gotta use the terms at the appropriate time, Ben. That's the next step. Not just spewing. No, we don't use exercise as punishment.
Never do that.
Never do that. That's a bad behavior.
There'll be a stage one.
My birthday.
You can get fit.
All right, so started looking at neurons and a brief review of what's going on at the synapse. Right. So for us, most of the time we're going to be looking at a synapse between a motor nerve and the surface of the muscle fiber. Right. So the technical term for a synapse at that position is the neuromuscular junction. But the neuromuscular junction is a synapse. It works the same way. Okay? So point of communication between two excitable cells. So two nerve cells within the nervous system, or in our case, communication between the nervous system and the muscular system. So what happens when we get a signal down the nerve from the central nervous system is when it reaches the end of the nerve, so in the dendrite, okay, then there are little kind of storage points in the end of that dendrite that contain a chemical that is capable of transmitting the signal across the gap. The signal is electricity. I can't transmit electricity across the gap, so I have to change it from an electrical signal into a chemical signal, flood the gap, and then turn it back into an electrical signal on the post cell. So, neurotransmitter is the chemical. It's going to transmit the nervous signal. And then once it floods across the little gap, it's going to attach to receptor sites on the postsynaptic tissue. So the receptor site is similar to the idea we had when we looked at sliding filament theory. Right? In order for the myosin head to attach, the receptor site had to be available. Here we're looking at a chemical receptor site, but it's the same idea. Right? I've got to have the chemical available in the pre-synaptic tissue. I release the chemical, it has to attach the other side of the gap. If enough of it attaches, we see enough chemical attaching to the receptors, then we can initiate the electrical signal again, the other side. Right. On page 105 in your book, there's a more detailed diagram of this. So this is kind of the cartoon version, but let me just make sure I've got that page number right. Yeah. So on page 105, this bottom part of the diagram here gives you a much more detailed picture of this process. Right. Okay? Synapse should be reviewed, I think. You should have gone through this material in AMP, so it's just to remind you what's going on. What we're interested in when we're looking at this is the signal from the central nervous system telling the muscle to move, transmitting that signal across the neuromuscular junction, and initiating the signal so that we see contraction in the muscle. So when the chemical swads across the synapse, it has to bind to the receptor site. The receptor site is made up of protein, and they're very specific. So a particular chemical can't just attach to any receptor site that's over there. It has to be a particular one. Right? And so by having just a particular substance matching a particular site, it allows for the muscle to only react to the correct signal. Right? Otherwise, there'd be all kinds of information and the muscle wouldn't work correctly. It wants to only respond to a motor nerve signal. So, it binds to the receptor, and then the receptor opens ion channels. So if I get enough neurotransmitter, enough chemical, binding to enough receptors and opening these ion channels, I can reinitiate the electrical signal. Electrical signal, electrical current, exactly the same way it is if you do wiring in your house, right? It just means that there's an imbalanced charge across, in our case, a membrane. So, only one kind of ion per receptor. Everything is highly, highly specific. That's the big picture. Right? I'm not going to go through this. I said to you last week, make sure you check your organization of the nervous system, but it's there. Okay? And we've got peripheral, we've got central. Okay? My central nervous system, we talked about the interneurons. We'll come back and have a look at those. And then we have our sensory and our motor sections of our peripheral that we mentioned last week. Anybody know what the neurotransmitter for the neuromuscular junction is? It's a chemical called acetylcholine, and we just make it easy for ourselves and call it ACH. Right? So when we go back here, these little red blobs, the chemical molecule, would be ACH between the motor nerve and the muscle. So, you can go through this, if you prefer it in words, to the boxes. We don't spend too much time on the brain structure itself, because what we're interested in is the signal telling us what to do. Okay? But what I do want to just point out, because this is important to what we see in motor control and movement, here is my motor cortex. So it's just in front of the central sulcus. Okay? And here is my sensory cortex. So this is the part of the brain that is receiving any signal from sensory organs. Okay? Now, if it's a visual signal, it goes to the visual cortex first. But things like our proprioceptors and our Golgi tendon organs, right, send information to the sensory cortex. It just so happens it lays right next door to the motor cortex. That's very beneficial because it means that the amount of time it takes for the motor cortex to receive information that's been translated in order to make a decision what movement to create is very minimal. Right? If the sensory cortex was down here and the motor cortex was over here, we would not see such smooth, quick responses to incoming signals. Because there would be a time delay while the sensory part of the brain talked to the motor part of the brain. And again, this is mostly outside what we want to spend our time on, but you just want to have an idea of, remember we said the motor nerve, the cell body for the motor nerve is inside the spinal cord. So once that motor nerve exits the spinal cord, I have one axon to whichever muscle it's stimulating. Right? There's no additional meeting up and talking to another nerve cell. How many of you have had a concussion? Ooh, way too many. Okay, so you want to pay attention then to the concussion information on page 109. All right? Concussions aren't always a blackout. And some of the symptoms that we sometimes see are because our brain is in a hard box, which is great, but there's a little space and it can bang around inside the hard box. And it's very, very, very soft, delicate tissue. So when it bangs up against the inside of your skull, it sometimes gets bruised. So that how much damage, how much bruising, how much swelling dictates how big the symptoms might be that you might see, or how minimal the symptoms are. Just because they're hardly there doesn't mean the person is not concussed. Once we've got athletes that have had one concussion, they're much more prone to a second concussion. So we want to pay attention to what's going on. And there's some link between these concussions and various kinds of disorder like epilepsy maybe. Some people are arguing it might be linked to Alzheimer's or depression. We don't know enough about what's going on. But we do see some impact on coordination and movement skills that we're able to see from the outside. Unless you're a qualified athletic trainer, then you're not going to be the person who's really qualified to say whether someone has a concussion or not. Play safe. If you think someone hit their head, then get them checked out. That's all you can do. If you're a PE teacher and you're working with a teenager, then make sure that there's some kind of message, phone message, email message sent to a parent so that the parent knows the kid hit their head. Because the kid might not tell them. Teenagers don't talk very much with their parents. You give the teenager a note and you say, make sure you give that to your parent. They need to know you hit your head. And they stuff it in their bag and they don't talk to their parents all night. Because they're upstairs playing video games, right? And the parents don't know that the individual hit their head. Okay, so a knee tap reflex is a good way of testing how the muscle spindles and the GTOs are working. So they often use it in a physio situation. They might use it in an injury situation to see whether or not. I've seen people who've blown their knee out and that knee reflex never really works correctly after the knee is rehab, right? Because the nerves, they do so much damage that the nerves don't completely work. So here, it's my quad. I tap the knee, it stretches the quad. If I stretch the quad quickly, which receptor is responding? Which of the two? That's the muscle. Which receptor? Which sensory organ? Spindle or GTO? Stretch the muscle quickly. Which one is going to send a signal? Spindle. Okay. Muscle spindles respond to stretch. So I tap the tendon, it stretches the quad. The muscle spindle sends a signal to the spinal cord. Okay. And it synapses with the motor nerve to come back and contract the muscle. It inhibits the hamstring because I don't want the quad contracting and the hamstring contracting at the same time. Okay, so we turn off the contraction in the hamstring, we contract the quad, we see a knee jerk. Here's our interneuron. The interneuron is the little nerve cell in the spinal column. So it allows one side of the sensory, the nervous system to talk to the motor side. It's all about talking and communicating. There's another one. That one's looking at the reciprocal innervation. So I have to turn off the antagonist if I'm going to contract the agonist. That's all we're looking at. Don't get caught up with the big fancy words. Okay. Reciprocal innervation just means I've got to turn off the muscle the other side of the joint. If I'm going to contract one, I have to turn the other side off. Right? Unless it's postural, I don't want both sides of the joint contracting at the same time. Make sense? Right? I can't throw a ball if my bicep is contracting. I have to be able to contract my tricep and relax my bicep. Same thing happens with the sensory organs and the information from the spindles and the GTOs. Alright, so peripheral. Anything outside the brain and the spinal column is peripheral. And I have two sections of the peripheral, the autonomic and the sensory nervous system. The autonomic nervous system controls unconscious types of things. Okay, so my heart rate. You don't spend a lot of time thinking about making your heart beat. It just happens, right? It happens because your brain tells it to happen, and your brain and your central nervous system keep it under control. Blood pressure, digestion, breathing. I can think about breathing, but most of the time I don't think about breathing. Someone dunks me underwater, I start thinking about breathing. Right? But most of the time, you don't consciously control your breathing. And there's another subdivision when we look at that global system that's doing the unconscious stuff. We've got sympathetic and parasympathetic. Our sympathetic is our fight or flight. Am I going to punch the tiger on the nose? Am I going to run the heck away? Right? I'm angry or I'm scared. I've got to do one or the other. If I'm backed in a corner, what's my response? Do I fight my way out? or do I try to run away? So what we see when that system is put into action is lots and lots of systems that get stimulated to help you deal with that stress and to help you survive. So already we've looked at energy systems. If I'm going to run away, what do I need to make ATP? If I've got to run the heck away, I might need oxygen if I have to run a long way, right? Good. What else am I going to need? What if I'm only running a short way and climbing a tree? Which energy source would I use? I'm going to use fats. Carbs. All right, so when we look at this system then, when we're under stress, when we're having to survive, anything to do with making ATP faster is going to ramp up, right? So I'm going to make carbohydrate much more available very quickly. I'm going to start breathing and dilating blood vessels so that if I need it, I can get oxygen into the muscle a lot more quickly. So when I get angry, my heart rate increases. Often, if you pay attention to it, it's quite interesting when you get angry or when you're stressed. For a lot of people, their response is to eat something, because your metabolism gets quicker, and so you get hungry a little bit sooner. So I increase my heart rate, I increase my blood pressure, I've got to get carbohydrate and oxygen to the muscles more quickly. Right? I increase blood flow to the skeletal muscles, which means I decrease blood flow to other parts of my body. I've got to get glucose into the bloodstream. So I've got some carbohydrate in the muscle, but I have that additional store back in the liver that we don't have to use very often. I've got to mobilize that store as well. What if I have to, not just run and climb the tree, but then smack someone on the nose because they're trying to climb up after me? How do I do that physically? So danger puts us in this mode. If I feel threatened, then I go into fight or flight. If I am very excited about something, we tend to go into fight or flight, so heart rate goes up. When we exercise, we also stimulate this system because it's a stressor. So we see heart rate go up and blood pressure go up when we exercise. Even though we're not in danger, it still stresses the system, and so we see this occurring. The other half of that system then, our parasympathetic system, is the one that's trying to calm us down. It's my rest or digest. I need to chill. I've got to bring my heart rate back down. I need to digest the food I'm eating, because otherwise I can't store it, I can't use it. So I want to, we used that word last week, homeostasis. I want to help the body get back to where it was. It wants to get back to resting levels. Okay. So lowers blood pressure, slows my heart rate down, increases blood flow to the skin. Why do you think it increases blood flow to the skin and moves? I was diverting it to the muscles when I needed to run away. Why do I now want to divert it to the skin?
Your body temperature.
Good. Decrease body temperature. right? I want to get all that blood that's now very hot, it's got a lot of heat in it, because it's been running through the muscles and the muscles have been making ATP. Now I have to get rid of all that heat. And we see your digestive peristalsis, your saliva comes back, normal bladder function. What you find when you're very, very stressed is you tend to stop urinating for a while because all the blood is being diverted to your muscles and away from everything else in the body that's not urgent. So the autonomic system, all these things that are unconscious that help us to just function on a daily basis. The sensory nervous system is responsible then for what do I do now I see the ball. So it's got to coordinate how I'm going to react to something. And we've got the sensory division. Remember we talked about that last week. The part of this that takes the signals from the receptor to the central nervous system. Maybe just the spinal cord, but a lot of information goes to the brain as well. And then the motor division is the bit that brings all the information back from the brain to make us move. Okay? So, when you go through your book, if you like that diagram, then you should be able to look at this diagram and recognize what each box is responsible for doing from a movement point of view. When would we use it? Right. All right, so one of the things I wanted to run through. If my heart rate goes up when I exercise, then my heart rate goes up because I stimulate, I add a stress, exercise, and my sympathetic nervous system responds by increasing the heart rate. So your heart has the endings of nerves that sit within the sympathetic system that synapse with the heart muscle. And when you exercise, those nerves carry a signal from the brain telling the heart muscle to contract quicker. Okay? So that's my sympathetic increases heart rate. So, at the end of the exercise, we have to bring our heart rate back down. We want to bring heart rate back to its resting level. So, I have to not just turn off the sympathetic signal, I have to turn on the parasympathetic signal to bring the heart rate back down. So the heart also has nerve endings from the parasympathetic nervous system that synapse, so that your central nervous system, your brain, has good control over what's going on there. Do I need it high? Do I need it low? When I train then, if I go for a run every day, what would you expect to see happen with your heart rate when we're training? We talked a bit about this in the lab. my resting heart rate is 75, and I start an endurance program, I'm riding my bike, or I'm walking, or I'm running, or I'm taking an aerobics class, or a step class, or a Zumba class, what do you expect? What would you tell someone was going to happen to their resting heart rate? Not your exercise heart rate, your resting heart rate. So it's 75. In 4 weeks' time, would it be 85 or 65?
65.
Right. So my resting heart rate would go down if I exercise a lot, right? Okay. So what that shows us then is that the parasympathetic signal to the heart is trainable. I can turn it up. The stronger the signal, or the more signal, the lower the heart rate is. So I can train the parasympathetic signal. Because the other thing that happens is my heart rate might be 150 while I'm doing this exercise, but in 4 weeks' time it might only be 142 when I'm doing this exercise. Which means either I don't turn this on quite as much, which seems a little more doubtful. Most of the training effect seems to occur in the parasympathetic system. You've got to start thinking about what you expect to see happen. Your heart rate doesn't just go down, right? Dinner doesn't just appear on the table by itself. Someone bought it, someone cooked it, someone served it, right? Exactly the same thing is going on with your body. If something happens, there's a reason for it, there's a mechanism for it. So what's going on? Because if I know what's going on, then I'm better able to prescribe a program to help train it. So this stuff isn't the applied kind of training stuff, but I've got to know this in order to think about, well then what do I want to see happen? Does that make sense? So you've got to think a little bit outside the box when you're starting to look at this material, because I want to be able to exercise, which means I'm going to turn this system on all the time. Well, do I want high heart rate and high blood pressure all the time? No. So there has to be some adaptation in the system due to training that helps me bring my heart rate down, which is a healthy response, and bring my blood pressure down, which is a healthy response. It's Monday, guys. You're supposed to be all, go home. I know it's cold. That's okay. All right? Okay, so let's see. Where are we going next? How many more classes of this chapter do we have? Let's see. Today is the 23rd. We only have one more class, so let's have a look. All right, one thing for you to think about before Wednesday. Here's my cell body in the spinal cord. Here's the axon of the motor nerve, and it is synapsing with a muscle. Now, if I am a type 1 nerve, I'm going to synapse with type 1 fibers. So are they the slow or the fast ones?
Slow.
Slow. Right? Type 1 is the old slow twitch. Type 1 fibers are highly oxidative. They're very, very, very good at using system 3 to make ATP and of getting oxygen into the cell and using it to pick up hydrogen at the end of the electron transport chains. So, if this motor neuron 1 is a type 1 nerve, then it will synapse with type 1 fibers. Okay. So in this muscle, I've got 4 type 1 fibers. There's always more than that. If you go back to the slides last week and look at that cross-section where we looked at the black and the white muscle cells getting bigger, seeing hypertrophy after resistance training, if I cut through a muscle, some of them are type 1s and some of them are type 2s that make up that muscle. Right? I don't have just one cell making a muscle. It's like my skin. Right? My skin is not one cell. Loads and loads and loads of cells all work together. So in a muscle, there's not just one muscle cell. There's lots of different muscle cells. So, in this abstract muscle, right, in this diagram, I have 1, 2, 3, 4 slow twitch fibers. And this neuron 2 is going to be a type 2. And we're not going to worry at this point whether it's a type 2A or a type 2X. All we care about is it's a type 2. So it's different to this because type 2 muscle fibers don't use oxygen very well, but they're very good at creating power. They contract very quickly, and so they're good at creating power. So the nerve, the motor nerve, that attaches to a type 2 is a little bit different because they adapt slightly. Same muscle, but this nerve is going to attach to the type 2 fibers. So one of the really cool things that your brain has to do is decide which one of these to turn on. It's not turning on a muscle, it's turning on cells within a muscle. So does it turn on the type 2 or does it turn on the type 1? Same muscle. What kind of response does it need that muscle to make at this point in time for the skill it's asking it to do? That's the key. That's where the motor control and the motor behavior stuff comes in. It's difficult to tease all the 3 sciences apart because now I'm looking at what happens in the physiology, but what was the decision as to which nerve to turn on? So the other thing you want to pay close attention to when you look at this diagram is the type 1 neuron attaches to type 1 fibers. If I turn that neuron on, all those fibers contract. Or none of them contract because the signal's not strong enough. Right? I can't turn it on and say I'm only going to turn on this fiber and this fiber. That doesn't happen. Right? If that cell turns on, any of the muscle fibers it's attached to will contract. Now, when you look at a muscle, there's way more than one type 1 nerve and way more than one type 2 nerve. Right? This is just a simplified version. So, think about this because we're going to come back to this diagram on Wednesday and look at it some more. Because this impacts everything we do with training. Right? Got to get out of the habit. It's one of those lay people things. We tend to talk about muscles being fast twitch or slow twitch. Muscles are type 1 or type 2. No. Muscle cells are type 1 or type 2. Not the muscle. A muscle is comprised of both type 1 and type 2. It's the ratio that's the key. over the weekend. Please, please, please look at your structure of your nervous